afternoon, everyone. I am Efecan Gürcan, editor-in-chief of Global Geopolitics, senior fellow at London School of Economics, and adjunct professor at Şangay Üniversitesi. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this very special event, the launch of Global Geopolitics and the first webinar of our journal on multipolarity. Speaking of multipolarity, at the moment, it really seems that tensions and rivalries are shaping the agenda in world politics. And clearly, there seems to be a renewed interest in geopolitics, in the study of geopolitics. So Global Geopolitics as a new journal was launched to respond to this global demand. But I also like to emphasize that we are not here to take sides or add fuel to the fire. Instead, we are here to offer a truly global and inclusive platform which would embrace a variety of perspectives and voices from both the global south and global north. And just as importantly, we also want to highlight that we highlight not only rivalries, but also global connections and international opportunities for international cooperation. Our journal is now open for submission, so please feel free to visit our new website, www.globalgeopoliticsjournal.com. And on our new website, you will find, you'll be able to read our active calls for papers, including the one about, the one for our inaugural issue on multipolarity, details about our editorial board, and of course, equally importantly, our submission guidelines. All right, so much for self-promotion. Let's move on to the real reason why we're here today. The theme of today's webinar wasn't just picked at random. Nowadays everybody is talking about multipolarity. And even 2025 Munich Security Report was framed around the theme of multipolarity, and the report itself framed multipolarity as a defining trend in international relations. So today, we're very lucky to have an incredible lineup of speakers, of scholars, prominent scholars who are also part of our editorial board to discuss multipolarity. First, we have Professor Guo Changgang, the distinguished professor in the Department of History at Şangay University, and he's also affiliated with the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. Second, we have Radhika Desai, professor in the Department of Political Studies, and also the chair of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba. And just like me, she is also a visiting professor at London School of Economics. Our third speaker is Hasan Ünal, professor of political science and international relations at Başkent University, Ankara. And our fourth and final speaker is Pascal Lotaz, associate professor of international relations at Kyoto University. If you don't mind, we can start with Professor Guo. And Professor Guo, if you are ready, the floor is all yours. And just in case you have a PowerPoint to share, screen sharing has already been enabled, but please remember to stop sharing once your presentation is finished. All right?
Okay, thank you, Efe. Thanks for this really fascinating event. First thing first, I'd like to say congratulations to the launch of the first issue of Global Geopolitics, and thanks for this event. I do prepared a PowerPoint, but it's difficult to upload. I'll try, but I don't think to make any trouble, so I don't want to use PowerPoint. Maybe we need more power and need more points. Today's topic is the second version of Donald Trump's administration and the global order. Given the limited time, Sardas told me maybe better finish in 15 minutes. So I think I'd like to focus on restructure of global order. Don't talk about Donald Trump. When we speak of restructuring, the first question we must ask is, what was the original global order? Without doubt, it was the Western-dominated global order, one established in 19th century and had persisted for nearly or more than 200 years. Following the Second World War, non-Western societies began efforts to reshape the Western-dominated global order, that is, to restructure this order, this system. I would argue that this process of restructuring has unfolded in three phases, or, to borrow Samuel Huntington's terminology, three waves, with the current era situated in the third wave. In his famous book, The Third Wave, Democratization in the Late 19th Century, Samuel Huntington posited that the world experienced three major waves of democratization. His framework of three democratic waves can also be interpreted, or I would rather to interpreted as reflecting the trajectory of Western-led global order. From its emergence consolidation and to its eventual or so-called universal acceptance. This is because Samuel Huntington's third wave of democratization, synonymous with westernization, swept across nearly the entire globe, excluding or except the Middle East or West Asia and North Africa by the 1990s. It was precisely this phenomenon that fueled the Western narrative of the end of history, put it as Fukuyama, during that decade. In response to the Western constructed global order, the efforts of non-Western societies to restructure this system has similarly unfolded in three distinctive waves. The first wave began from the post-World War II. The post-World War II era saw decolonization and national liberation movements, which not only precipitated the collapse of Western colonial systems, but also gave rise to a distinct geopolitical division, the West and the rest. This division extended beyond political opposition to encompass ideological and value-based confrontations. The first wave of restructuring reached its climax in 1970s, to be specific, 1974. That year, the fourth summit of non-aligned movement called for reforming unequal international economic relations. In the same year, at the urging of developing nations, the sixth special session of the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Establishment of a new international economic order and the Program of Action for a new international economic order. In December 1974, the 29th UN General Assembly passed the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, outlining 20 principles for establishing a new international economic order. However, these efforts by non-West societies or developing countries to establish a new international economic order ultimately faltered. The prevailing economic reality remained one of the center periphery division, as depicted in raw Purvis dependency theory and Emil Wallerstein's world system theory, with West societies firmly entrenched at the center of the global order. The second wave of the restructuring of the global order, to me, came from the 1990s, the heyday of neoliberalism, to the first decades of the 21st century. This wave can be seen as a response to Samuel Huntington's third wave of democracy. Huntington argues that the third wave of democratization began in 1974 and by 1990s had swept through most countries and regions of the world except Middle East and peaked in 1989. With the dramatic changes in Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union as important events in this wave of democratization, however, Huntington also pointed out that despite the unstoppable wave of democracy and the democratic politics becoming a universal value, the Arab countries in the Middle East and North Africa were the exceptions to the third wave of democratization, which brought the third wave of democratization to a standstill in late 1990s. In fact, as Huntington said, from the 1970s to the 1990s, Western societies got rid of the influence of the decolonization movement in the developing countries. Neoliberalism prevailed. Western-led globalization advanced deeply. Most of the countries in the world chose the Western model of a market economy. And even China also entered the period of reform and opening up. The Western model of development and social system and values seemed to have become the universal choices, and history seems to have really come to an end. However, the West Asia and North Africa regions had become the main region to say no to the Western neoliberal globalization, and has become the flag bearer of the struggle against the Western-dominated global order. I think this is the second wave of against the Western-dominated global order. While the first wave of resistance took the form of a war to gain national independence, the second wave is characterized by the regional characteristics of West Asia and North Africa, with religion or values as the mobilizing force. There are both moderate rebellions and extreme impact of terrorist attacks. For moderate rebellions, I think can see the global religious awakening, including the Islamic awakening, is the main manifestation, i.e., the struggle against secularism or secularization with those countries. The third wave, say, if we must identify a starting point or landmark event for the third wave of efforts to reshape the global order, I would choose the year 2011. Why I choose 2011? So we all know the 2008 and 8 financial crisis severely impacted Western societies. In 2010, China became the world's second largest economy. In 2011, the killing of Osama bin Laden marked a temporary pause in the global war on terrorism. In November of 2011, U.S. President Obama announced the pivot to Asia. At the 2012 Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, U.S. Defense Secretary Kananta first proposed the Asia-Pacific rebalance strategy. By the year 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative as a response, I think, which can be seen as a formal prelude to the third wave of efforts to restructure the Western-dominated global order. Under the impact of this wave of global order restructuring, Western societies began embracing populism or deglobalization. Thus, the emergence of Trump, first version of a Trump administration, actually was not an accident. Meanwhile, with the collective rise of global South, countries in the global South has become vital forces in maintaining world peace, promoting shared development, improving global governance, and reshaping the international order. In this context, the second version of Trump administration should be viewed as an inevitable logic result or outcome of non-Western society's efforts to reconstruct the global order. Western societies maintain their dominance over the global order in the first phase mainly through military hard power. In the second phase, beginning in the 1970s, they rely mainly on soft power, such as technology and financial hegemony. Now, in the third phase, as the global South rises and the U.S. dollar's hegemony faces challenges, I want to put a question mark on tariff wars, cheap wars, I don't think those wars will succeed. So my answer is no. Tariff wars, cheap wars will not succeed. That's what I want to share. Thank you.
Professor Go, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and rich presentation. I think your contribution helps ground our understanding of multipolarity in a much deeper context, especially when it comes to the historical dynamics of the transformation of the global world order. Thank you so much. And now let's move on to our next speaker. I'm very pleased to pass the floor to Professor Pascal Lotas. He is a professor of international relations at Kyoto University. Whenever you're ready, Professor Lotas.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind invitation and this great panel, and also congratulations to this new journal. I find it a fantastic and wonderful initiative. It's good to have a journal with multipolarity at its heart. And I'll try to not speak much more than 7-8 minutes, so we have time for discussion. But I would go even further than Professor Guo and say, like, what we are witnessing at the moment is the continuation of the gradual end of the Western colonial order. And this is an end to a 500, nearly 600 year project that began in Europe, but then through extreme violence and genocide, of course, also became a North American project. The dominance of these Western powers on the European continent, North American continent, that ending now is extremely it's dangerous. Because the former colonial powers are still clinging to that power, and the Europeans will tell you that, oh, no, we are not colonial anymore. It's like, yes, you are. You're colonial in your mindset, and you're colonial in your approach toward the rest of the world. One just needs to look at the way the European Union all but ignores the African continent and views much of its closest near abroad as a source of threat rather than a source of opportunity. The North Americans at the same time have built upon this former colonial network, and then also through this neo-colonial enterprise of neoliberalism, of how also Professor Guo pointed out, have dominated the rest of the globe, right? They've dominated it economically, dominated it with infrastructure, militarily, and so on, and have not shied away from intervening even after 1945 abroad, and with all of its regime change operations, they range from around the globe, right? From South America, Chile, from to Indonesia in the 1960s, to really also provoking large scale wars against enemies, and what we are experiencing right now with Ukraine. Which even now after 3 years, and even now after several publications on the depth of the involvement of the United States in making sure that this war is all but inevitable, even now the Europeans are pretending that this is an unprovoked attack, right? Even just the use of the word unprovoked should be ample evidence that it was very much provoked. But the thing is, Ukraine is not the only such case. It's just the latest one. If you also look at the way that the Afghanistan war against the Soviet Union was made all but inevitable, and how the United States has systematically worked on undermining the escalatory principles in international relations, that becomes clear. And my own field of study is neutrality, and the way that the United States and Europe have undermined neutrality, which is an obvious no-brainer way of trying to de-escalate contested situations. It's really quite scary and frightening. But this is to me the outcome of this decline of the West in relative terms and in absolute terms. And that this is failing at the moment, we are seeing clearly, because one thing that was essential to this Western order for the last 500 years was the ability to set the agenda intellectually and mentally, and the framing of how we perceive these periods. And that is gone. One just needs to look at Gaza. The Europeans and North Americans can pretend as much as they want that this is not a genocide. The majority of the world understands it. And even a good part of the populations in Europe and North America understand that what we are witnessing is a genocide in front of our eyes. And it's not just any genocide. It's the logical outcome of how these white settler colonial states work, and how they used to work. And the tragedy of it is that this is, of course, not unique. I mean, this is what the people in Gaza are experiencing at the moment, is what many indigenous populations around the globe had to experience for the last 500 years. It's the reason why the North American continent has been mostly emptied of its indigenous populations, Australia and New Zealand too. And it is no coincidence that this is the world when we talk about the West, right? That this is the value community of people who cooperates, because they still intrinsically understand that their project belongs together, and they're othering these peoples of West Asia, peoples of East Asia, and this is now definitely changing again, also because this great power approach at just dominating the discursive space, the military space, and so on is not working anymore. The breakup of Russia didn't work. The proxy war in Ukraine is failing in front of our eyes. So is the soft power of the United States. The fact that the United States is now rooting out political dissent in its institutions of higher education is another one of these moments when you can see that there's no other option left than now trying to physically get rid of people who disagree. And this, of course, undermines now the entire value proposition of the US education system, which until very recently was still, despite problems, let's say, between the US and China, was a major attraction for Chinese students to go and study there and get the best of educations. And so it was also for Indian students and colleagues. But this is all now in reverse drive, because the discursive space cannot be monopolized anymore. We are also seeing a failure of the European Union, for instance, as a model. Only 10, 15 years ago, the European Union was going around the world telling everybody from Mercosur in South America to ASEAN that they should be more like the EU, because the EU was this model of how states in the modern globalizing world cooperate. That too is over, and ASEAN is very happy. And I've talked to several ASEAN diplomats. They're very happy that they never ever tried to imitate the EU, but that they, from the very start, had a multipolar model with all of its costs and benefits. The benefits being that you have each member has a veto. You work together, but you don't integrate. On the other hand, you of course have costs of this cooperation, but you pay these costs and you try to create consensus, which is very different from the European approach of trying to unify and create centralized structures. And this seems, to me at least, now relatively clear to large parts of the global south, that these models do not serve as an aspiration anymore, but as something that needs to be avoided. We are also seeing what I believe is a weird and unexpected version of end-stage capitalism. And maybe I want to talk to Radhika at some point about this one. But, what we are seeing, I think, is even something that Marx didn't foresee, which is that capitalism can eat itself by financialization. The entire value proposition of capitalism is that you create capital is in the hand of private actors that's then reinvested and creates infrastructure and creates prosperity. What we're seeing now is that capital is being given to the financial sector, which then puts it into a huge casino in order to let people gamble with it. And the infrastructure of even the United States is crumbling. It's crumbling and it's getting old. And there's no reinvestment because all of the capital is being used for gambling. This is again out of the logic of the system that, in my view, is now leading to this downturn on this loss also of prestige, and the United States is now compensating by trying to externalize all of these failings. Last but not least, I do think that multipolarity in this sense creates actually certainty, the certainty that individual states are not able to dominate, at least for a couple of decades, I would say, and that we are now living in a world where where power is more equally shared. The question that we need to figure out an answer to is how to enable conflict that does not become war, because conflict is normal and conflict happens all the time. My hope is that the multipolar setup, especially from the Asian side, but also from the African side, actually is able to create these new models of how you deal with border disputes without them becoming wars, of how you deal with ethnic disputes without them becoming genocide. The way that India and China have responsibly been dealing with their border disputes, while also cooperating in BRICS, is to me a shimmer of hope. And I hope that the BRICS model is going to be one built rather around consensus and less around the question of who dominates who else. And yes, I'll close with that.
Professor Lotas, many thanks for such a powerful presentation, expanding on Professor Go's historical framework in the context of a declining West. And perhaps what I found most valuable in your presentation is that you aptly pointed out the current dangers and risks humanity has been facing. And in many ways, I think that also points to the ever increasing relevance of neutrality in our era. Again, thank you so much. And now let's hear from our third speaker. I'm happy to turn it over to Professor Hasan Ünal from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Başkent University. Over to you, Hasan, Professor Hasan.
Thank you, Efecan. Thank you for inviting me to this very actually good and also very timely webinar. And greetings to all colleagues from Ankara. Now, what I would like to do is that I would like to basically try to place multipolarity into some sort of perspective. Now, until recently, the word multipolarity, the very phrase, was something sort of detested and hated, particularly in the collective West, and particularly the American policymakers and others never wanted to use it. But over the last 10 years or so, and particularly over the last few years, multipolarity has become something unstoppable. And there is also international recognition that multipolarity is going to be back again the world order. Now, if it is now, when we see the Western reaction to multipolarity, it is something like, oh, the rules-based order is gonna come, is gonna be over, and it's going to be replaced by uncertainty, and then there's going to be all the troubles across the world, and no underlining basically order, international order for the world. I think this is understandable from one point of view, because the collective West is at the losing end when you talk about the multipolarity basically emerging. Now, the real history tells us that multipolarity is not an exception, but it is basically the main feature of the world history. In other words, broadly speaking, basically the world order has always been multipolar, except the Cold War period, which was generally speaking considered to be bipolar, although whether it was bipolar or not, because China conflict in the 1950s, and then the entry into the world system, the non-allied movement and what have you, almost turned it into a multipolar world order. But there was also Western dominance in many respects, and the Soviet sort of prevalence across a certain part of the world, a considerable part of the world. So we can still, consider that bipolar. But then the unipolar world order was something totally out of order, because in the world system over the last 500 years or so, there was never a unipolar world order. Almost, the dialectic of balance of power politics doesn't let one single power basically control the rest of the world one way or the other, or the other, or at least its influence would be prevalent across the world in such a way as the United States influence over the last, from the end of the bipolar world order, in other words, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, right up to something like 5-10 years ago. So, for instance, just a look at the history of the last 500 years or so would demonstrate that the world has always been multipolar, in the sense, for instance, initially we can talk about in the 1500 the dominance of the Iberian Peninsula powers, and then France comes up to counterbalance their dominance. But it doesn't mean that the Iberian dominance basically goes into total negligence. But they remain some sort of considerable powers in their own weight. But France becomes the dominant among the great powers of Europe. In other words, then you have the Spanish Succession War, which brings England, or which paves the way for England to basically play an important role, and gradually England becomes a dominant power, at least in the colonial world. With the unification of Germany, then Germany establishes itself as the most powerful state on the European continent. Meanwhile, you have the Habsburg monarchy basically transforming itself into Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you also have Russia rising from the east. So the system of these powers basically is such that you have a more powerful country or two, like in the 19th century, late 19th century, you have Germany and Britain being the most powerful colonial power, and Germany the most powerful power on the European continent. So this is how they went into the First World War, having fallen into two rival camps, and then you have the First World War, and the interwar period was largely again on the basis of multipolarity, and the Second World War was also fought on the basis of multipolarity. Now, as I said, multipolarity has never been an exception to the world system, but it has been this system actually over the last 500 years or so. What is or what was exception was the bipolarity, and certainly unipolarity. Now, the world is transforming itself into multipolarity once again. But I think there are some major important differences. One is that the approaching multipolarity, or maybe we are well into it right now, is not going to be a Western-dominated multiple world order. It's not going to be dominated it's not going to be a European-dominated multipolarity. So over the last 500 years or so, what you have is, as the previous speaker said, basically touched upon, either through colonialism, imperialism, you have the Western countries basically dominating the world. Okay, and the rivalry, competition among the Western powers again would certainly impact the whole world, one way or the other. But for the first time, the multipolar world order we are fast basically going into is not going to be a Western-dominated multipolar world order. The sheer size of China, with all its resources, certainly makes it completely different. It is not going to be a Western-dominated multipolarity at all. Now, we can, for instance, point at certain superpowers coming out of the system, and basically, I think they are going to play very important roles in economically, trade-wise, as well as militarily, in the developing multipolar world order. And none is, only one would be a Western power, that is the United States, but the other two, China and Russia, from the Western perspective, are not necessarily Western powers. And prospective superpowers like India, Brazil, with all the potential to take their places in the list of the superpowers in a multipolar world order, in the league of the superpowers, again, are not necessarily Western powers from the Western point of view. So that this point, I think, is terribly important. That is the end of Western-dominated world order to all intents and purposes. The other thing is, actually, the collective world, the collective West, is certainly cracking up, as we see that in the foreign policy assertions of not only assertions but also foreign policy actions of Trump. So he doesn't necessarily take into account the collective West and its interests worldwide when he tries to bolster up the United States as an important power to play, very important role in the multipolar world order. As we can see, he demands Greenland of Denmark, and then makes he's not so much into the protection of European countries in the form of NATO. So he's basically concentrating on the strength and power of the United States, how to make the United States, as he says, great again. So that means the collective West is cracking up. And I think the other point that comes to mind is that we are also at the end of the ideologically driven realignments and perhaps and alliances of any sort. Now the ideologically driven alliances, I think, started at the end of the Second World War and went on throughout the Cold War. The West, at the time, for about 45 years or so, presented itself as the free world, as opposed to the Soviet Union, which the West presented as the non-free world. Okay? And then in the transformation from the bipolar world into the unipolar world order was that they came up with what they claim the value-based international relations. We can all dispute whether it was actually value-based or whether it was actually to certainly promote their national interests one way or the other. But this was the main structure of the collective West. And now we can again see in the foreign policy pronouncements and actions of Trump. For instance, he doesn't mind talking to Russia. He doesn't necessarily take seriously the previous administration's demonization of Moscow, because he thinks his interests and United States interests are certainly for better relations for Russia. What he has in mind in trying to basically build up build up good relation with Russia one way or the other, we don't know yet, but he may have certain intentions. Whether the Russians would actually buy that or not, again, remains to be seen. But what I'm saying here is that that ideologically driven foreign policy international realignments, I think, is fast coming to an end. The European Union appears to be a collection of seedy little bodies these days. They don't seem to have a clear-cut vision for the future and for the world at all. For instance, on the one hand, they are promoting some sort of a almost racial hatred of Russia. And they are also saying that they're going to basically fight Russia to the end, whatever it means. Let's not forget that the important personalities now in the European Union, pulling major strings, you used to talk until last year about breaking up Russia in small pieces. So, this is something like almost a racist approach to Russia. So you basically, because they are Russians, and we've got to fight the Russians all the way up to whatever it takes. So what I'm saying here is, on the one hand, this is the view they are promoting, which the European publics don't seem to buy anymore. But, the political elite is certainly promoting that or continue to promote it. On the other, For instance, if you are basically going to be so anti-Russian, then be friendly with other countries like, many other. But again, on that basis, they don't seem to a clear-cut framework for their security, for their blah blah. If you deny your industry the reasonably priced Russian energy, then you are going to be left out in the cold. And then Trump has basically sold them out, so they are extremely frustrated with the United States and Trump. But at the same time, if you are so frustrated with Trump and the United States, why don't you change your policy towards Russia? So none of their pronouncements and none of the actions they take adds up to something. So my basic analysis is that it won't take for this political elite in Europe to get out of the way. Maybe in a couple of years or 3, we are going to be seeing these elite losing the elections and then getting into the wilderness, never to come back to the center of international politics again. So it is a very interesting time, which is, as we speak and as we live in, and there is going to be a lot of opportunities for all the countries, including the medium-sized countries like Turkey, Iran, Germany, Britain, and others. So in addition to the superpowers, we are going to have quite a number of regional powers, and these regional powers, in the past, in no time in history, we had so many independent states, which you can break into leagues, if you like, superpowers and regional powers and small powers of this and the other. But this time we are going to have that. And in terms of balance of power, many of the medium-sized powers would have the potential to tilt the balance of power to the favor of blah blah superpowers or the other. And all these are going to be important, and we are going to have to wait and see. But what I would say, as I think Professor Lotas has pointed out, what they say in the West, in particular, that the multipolarity is going to be the beginning of all this sort of uncertainty in the world order, doesn't hold water. If anything, multipolarity is going to bring about a type of certainty, a new type of international relations, which will certainly benefit many countries of the world whose interests have been overlooked by the collective West until now. I think with this, I would conclude. Thank you.
Hasan Hoca, we truly appreciate your valuable insights on the shifting perceptions of multipolarity. And to me, I think the most striking aspect of your presentation was your observation that multipolarity has been a norm rather than an exception in the history of international relations. And the same goes for your observation that what we are experiencing now is the emergence of a new form of multipolarity. And this time, this multipolar system will not be led by Western powers. And now I'm delighted to introduce our fourth and final speaker, Professor Radhika Desai, chair of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba and also professor in that department. And let me add that I am also a proud member of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group since 2009, 2019. Yes? Over to you, Radhika.
Great. Thanks so much, Anse, and congratulations to you and all your team on launching this journal. I'm sure you're going to make it a great success because I know you're a young man of great energy.
So if you put capitalism at the center of your understanding of the world order of today and the world order since the beginnings of capitalism, since capitalism became a major force in the world, then the First World War appears to be a war caused by competing imperialisms of the major capitalist powers. And the entire 30 years crisis, as Arno Meyer called it, from 1914 to 1945, the two world wars, etc., they're all part of the same picture. And then, therefore, today's capitalism or today's crisis, that the one we are in right now, which is also very dangerous, would appear to be a result of the decline of capitalism. And and the danger comes primarily from the inability of the major capitalist powers to accept their decline, a point which many of you have already made, many of my co-panelists have already made. I think, Pascal, you were in particular emphasizing this. They cannot accept their decline, so they are doing everything in their power to hang on to what they perceive to be their rightful position of power and influence in the world. But they will not be able to stop it. Now, in this process, of course, there is the danger of war, but the danger of war arises primarily from these powers and presumably also from those other lesser powers whom they may instigate to go to war with one another, whether you are talking about the Ukraine conflict or the Gaza conflict and the potential possibility of war in South Asia today with the events of the last few days. So in all of these cases, the danger arises from that. So let me just explain very briefly how the analysis of geopolitical economy is different. So I would say, first of all, that geopolitical economy begins with an understanding of capitalism as contradictory. Capitalism aims to produce value, not houses or schools or cars or what have you. Capitalism aims to produce value. It is an inherently contradictory phenomenon. These contradictions pervade capitalism. They are across all the realms of social life in capitalism, not just in the realms of production and realization of surplus value, etc. So there are contradictions relating, for example, to capitalist society's relations with the environment, to the state, in international relations, etc., etc. And because capitalism is contradictory, it must engage in imperialism so that it can, a part of the way it can deal with the contradictions of capitalism, the capitalist state engages in imperialism, which is the subordination of other societies to its power, in order that some at least of the costs of dealing with these contradictions may be paid by these societies and not by the capitalist society themselves. And in this view, capitalism requires imperialism. So this kind of capitalist imperialism had already peaked in 1914. Since then, as I think Professor Gore very nicely pointed out in his various phases of the evolution of the world order, that since roughly 1945, the end of the crisis that began in 1914, you have been seeing the progressive diminution of the power of imperialism, which, of course, today the desperate attempts by leaders like Trump to hang on to the power to make America great again are ironically only helping to make China great again rather than making America great again. So in that sense, so we have been witnessing, and the reason for this decline is deeply bound up with the way in which geopolitical economy as an approach sees the evolution of the world order. So essentially, the imperialist impulse necessarily prompts in those countries that are willing and able an anti-imperialist impulse, a desire to essentially resist the power of imperialism and instead industrialize your own country, usually behind protectionist walls and so on, much in the way that the United States, Germany, and Japan, for example, industrialized in their time. Eventually leading, of course, through that imperial competition to the exhaustion of any further possibility of imperial expansion. And it is not a surprise, therefore, that this crisis of international crisis of capitalism, which was the First World War and the 30 Years crisis, also coincided with the emergence of socialism, with the beginning of the Soviet Union. Emergence of socialism as another form in which countries could develop. And it is not surprising also that since that time, barring exceptions which we can explain, like South Korea and Taiwan, which are small countries which industrialized because they were frontline states as far as the West was concerned in their battle against communism, and eventually today are imperialist allies. Barring these exceptions, the most successful forms of development have actually been in socialist countries. People forget, we are so used to being told that socialist economies are basket cases. The Soviet Union disintegrated because it was a basket case, that actually in the 50s and 60s, Western commentators were very wary of and in fact very grudgingly admired the fact that the Soviet Union had a consistent rate of growth. And of course, the Soviet Union was able to create a lifestyle and a material standard of living among its citizens that was at least comparable to that in the West. And today we are seeing China doing that as well. So this gives rise to the opposing or the answering effort of anti-imperialist development, which is, and looking this way, you also realize that the existence of socialism in the Soviet Union later today, later in China and elsewhere, is not necessarily premature. It is part of the geopolitical economy dialectic of capitalism, which is about imperialism and anti-imperialism, which is also then puts development of countries at the heart of understanding about the international relations of the world created by capitalism. So my view is that this answering development, this answering logic of developing your country, which Trotsky, by the way, enabled combined development, but whatever you call it, this anti-imperialist effort at developing your own society is what has spread productive capacity around the world. It has not been markets. It has not been imperialism. It has not been US hegemony. It's rather this the effort that has spread productive capacity and which today makes for multipolarity. F.A. mentioned that I it's also called International Manifesto Group and the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. But in 2020, a group of us also created another organization called the International Manifesto Group. And in 2021, in September of 2021, within a few weeks after India's exit of the United States from Afghanistan Manifesto, we entitled it Through Polarity to Socialism. So again, this manifesto, which is really just as long as an article about 8,000 words, about how to read and a very much urging to read it. And we've translated it into many languages, including Turkish, Chinese, and many others. But reason for choosing the word pluripolarity is that it's only after I wrote
mine. And the first book that I mentioned, Geopolitical Economy, and on a trip to Venezuela, I was in a conversation with people. It emerged that Chavez had been using the term clarity to describe the world order, because he wished to emphasize not just that there were today many ports of power around the world, but also the fact that each of these ports of power has a type of economic system. There are different types of capitalisms, different types of socialisms. Swedish capitalism is not the same as Japanese, it's not the same as American, etc. And similarly, the different socialist systems that have come into existence, and many of which still continue to exist, are of different types. So I would say, I guess, how much time do I have left? I can't hear you now. Anyway, I'll continue. I guess I have at least 5 minutes.
You still have, yes.
About 5 minutes, yeah. Okay, so the thing, so basically, the main point I want to make here is that we are seeing is the exhaustion of the capacities of capitalism to provide any kind of reasonable human decent society, decent standard of material well-being to the vast majority of the world, so that the options for the rest of the world are really socialist. That sponge of bake vis-a-vis the term multipolarity. I agree with Hassan Bekli says that multipolarity is the usual situation, not so multipolarity has existed a lot, and the only reason we need to use the term multipolarity is because through much of the 20th century, particularly at its close, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of communism in Eastern Europe, a lot of people thought that there were too big expectations at that time. Everybody now, but in the unipolar world, dominated by the United States, where there was no power to contest it, and people enjoy a peace dividend. But all of these two expectations have been fulfilled in the period since then. Very rapidly, it became very clear by the first decade of the century that U.S. power really, and not what it was made out to be. The United States was in a about 2008. It was of a major financial crisis from which it has never seemed to recover. So that unipolarity argument quickly began to fade away, and of course, the peace dividend argument also went out the window, and it was connected with this. That is, as the decline of the U.S. West became more and more clear, the effort of these countries to try and hang on, and especially the United States, to try and hang on to its power in the world, which took increasingly militarized forms, was in fact subjecting the world with endless series of wars, which we still made. So, in that sense, and one of the major argument that I'm making under the rubric of geopolitical economy is that is that the United States was never hegemonic. You heard people say that the US is hegemonic, although today that is fading fast. You've heard other people say that the United States was once hegemonic and it's now declining. My argument is that it was never hegemonic. It wanted from the beginning of the 20th century. It saw that the British power was waning, it was declining. Its ruling elites became committed to the idea of essentially becoming, taking over the sort of torch from the UK as they put it at that time, managing segment of the economy. So the idea, the US hegemony was more an ambition than an accomplished reality. And I've also developed a story about the decline of which is so centrally a part of the apparatus of US hegemony, but I won't go into that. But essentially, what we're looking at is a situation in which the US could not become hegemonic because the world was already multipolar. It had already become multipolar at the late 19th and early 20th century. That age of multipolarity, of course, eventuated the 30 Years' crisis, the crisis of imperialism, and so on. But today, I would say that, and this also then makes you understand that the major driver of conflict around the world has been capitalism. And today it is even more militaristic, prone to instigating and participating in wars and so on. But it is declining. And finally, my final point would be that in this age of multipolarity, I would, while of course the potential for conflict exists, comes largely from the decline of the capitalist world, I think that the more hopeful development is that the rest of the world, what Russians have begun to call the world majority, are increasingly gravitating towards ever closer relations with China, and China is promoting a very different paradigm of international relations in the world economy, of relations of mutual, relations of cooperation for mutual benefit. And I think that this paradigm has a great potential to prevail. Of course, it's not going to prevail automatically. Via far-sighted leadership in countries of this region, which often is missing, as you see today, for instance, in India, which you saw a few years ago in the case of Brazil with Bolsonaro's leadership. So I think the rest of the world will also have to see this potential, this possibility. We may also be looking forward to a long period in which the lesser capitalist powers, such as those of Europe, may finally come to see that they have, unless they wish to engage in conflicts that cannot, they do not have the capacity to weigh a potential which is always there, as Pascal, you were underlining. But if saner voices prevail, that there will be a bit of coexistence between these capitalist powers and the powers who have no option but to, as far as if they wish to develop, have no option but to undertake some or the other form of socialist development. So I think that for this current moment of multipolarity or pluripolarity, that there's great potential for progressive change as well.
Much appreciated, Radhika. And at this point, let me emphasize that Radhika's geopolitical economy is one of the most original and systematic approaches to multipolarity in the literature. And in line with that framework, in her presentation, she proposed a political economy approach to multipolarity. And accordingly, she rightly attributed the rise of multipolarity to the crisis of global capitalism. So with that, we have heard from all of our speakers. Many thanks for your valuable contributions. And now we are ready to open the floor for questions and discussion. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure to convey all these questions to our presenters. All right? Any questions from the audience? All right, I have a few actually, if I may. Radhika, I would like to start with you. Well, you recently proposed a new term to describe the multipolar transformations of the world order. It's called pluripolarity. So would you care to expand on this and its meaning?
Well, one way of doing it would be quite simply to say, there is a... Well, let me start again. The word globalization became very current in the 1990s. And I was always a skeptic of the idea of globalization. The idea that, the world has become flat, the states don't matter, etc., etc. And I always, pointed out that economies remain much more national than you think. There is a certain fantasy of capitalism, which is that, the whole world will become capitalist and will become uniform. And then, of course, those who are, some take the idea so seriously that they start worrying about how drably uniform the whole world would become if it became capitalist. But the important point to understand is that, in fact, no country has ever developed in a completely free market fashion in which the state has never played a role. The state has always played a central role in the development. Even, some people, Alexander Gerschenkron originated the term late development to denote the development of countries like the US or Germany and Japan and so on, where the state manifestly played such an important role. But this seemed to suggest that there was an early development, like that of the UK, for example, which did not involve the state. But of course, we know from the work of various people who have done work on developmental states that the state was always centrally involved. So in that sense, then, political traditions, of course, resource endowments, differing positions in the international order of imperialism, all of these make each country's development very different, very unique, whether you are capitalist or socialist. And therefore, also, there is this vast literature on varieties of capitalism, and of course, there are different types of socialist economy. So pluripolarity really is to me, I find it attractive because it questions these notions of fantasy notions of capitalism, which is that, a uniform capitalism can prevail over the world. It can't, because capitalism relies on imperialism. And therefore, that already creates a hierarchy, a non-uniformity. Of course, if these countries that face imperial power wish to industrialize, they have to resist imperial power, and they have to develop their economy through their own efforts, through the efforts of their own states, which will then again mean that each one of these will be different because historical legacies are different, institutional contexts are different, resource endowments are different, etc. So,
thank you, Radhika. Very, very helpful. My next question is actually directed to both Professor Guo and Professor Lotas. I mean, as you all know, this year we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. So my question is, how would you assess the enduring legacy of the Bandung Conference in shaping today's multipolar world? Please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much. So we cannot unmute ourselves. So I would say the legacy is huge, and it's another one of those legacies that the West is completely missing, and because they just don't see it. I mean, Bandung 55 was the first time that you had a major world conference that was not organized by the Europeans or the Americans, and it took place all the way in Indonesia, and it was a huge success, a tremendous success in attracting interest from everywhere. And I want to point out, including Japan, which in the end didn't join the non-aligned movement because unfortunately it was steered away from that course and into a hard alliance with the United States. But in 55, things were very much in the air, and neutralism was in the air, also in many parts of Europe, and that's really where the Cold War also against independence of a lot of states from a polarized system started. And of course, the Bandung then went into 1961 into the founding of the non-aligned movement, and the non-aligned movement was kept intentionally vague and loose as to reduce the potential for it to be undermined by one or the other powers, because we must not forget the Soviet Union too actually was part of this previous bipolar system. Although I would argue to a much lesser extent imperialistic than the United States was. Nevertheless, the polarization was there. And so I would say that the success of Bandung and the 70 years in between, this move towards empowerment of individual economies and states in the global South is something that ought to be remembered. And I see it more or less as the precursor to what BRICS is doing today in a different way, but a intellectual trajectory into what we've got today on a bigger scale.
Thank you so much, Professor Lotas. Professor Guo, do you have anything to add? Yes. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Say, as a historian, I always like to trace back. You know, history of human beings evolved along two dimensions. One dimension actually, say, in a specific society or country or civilization, say Turkey or China or Australia or Japan, means in a specific society, people to pursue equality, equal rights, from primitive to, from kingdoms to democratic society, try to pursue equality or equality for all human beings, for all the citizens. This is one dimension. Another dimension, I think, till now, the historians seldom to touch is internationally or globally. All countries, nations, civilizations, societies, or cultures also finally will pursue the situation, the status of equality. So for Bandung Conference, I think we can put for this mega background for human beings, the global world try to pursue a more equal or democratic global order. So for this, actually, we are planning to organize a conference in Brazil in this coming September to memorize Bandung Conference. I just want to say this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Guo. We're very much interested in knowing more about this conference as well. Mr. Isaac Ojok had a question. He would like to ask a question, and he could use a chat box in order for us to convey this question or these questions to our speakers. I mean, in the meantime, any others interested in asking questions? Well, I have another question for Professor Lotas, for example, and a question for Hasan Hoca. Hasan Hoca, how do you see the future of Sino-Russian relations in the Trump era? I'm very curious about this issue as well, especially, against the backdrop of the Ukraine crisis and all other developments, including Syria.
Well, it's not easy to answer, but what I gather from what I basically follow is that the China-Russia, if you like, alliance seems to be quite on a rock-solid ground. There are important reasons for both countries to carry on with that alliance or, understanding, if you like. I think one of the reasons is that is the untrust, none basically trust the Western world in general. The Trump era and Trump's foreign policy assertions are certainly different from his predecessors. But again, whether the United States would fall back upon its old premise acting together with the European powers or not remains to be seen. So basically, we will have to wait and see for quite some time whether or not the collective West. I mean, I am almost certain. I'm certain that the collective West is going to crack up in various ways. There's no question about that. I don't even think that Cold War integration processes like the European Union and the Cold War alliances like NATO would actually resist all the pressures of the multipolar world order. So in that sense, there's going to be a completely different kettle of fish for the Western countries. But Trump may have certain ideas at the back of his mind to break up the Sino-Russian alliance. But these days and in the foreseeable future, I don't see that happening.
Thank you very much, Hasan Hoca. And now our final question. Our final question is directed to Professor Oh, by the way, we have got a question in the chat. Let me see. Dr. Yongtao has a question directed to Professor Hasan Ünal.
Okay.
So the question is, after the arrest of Mayor İmamoğlu in Turkey, many people, especially the youngsters, they joined demonstrations to express their opposition. So in that case, what is the deeper reasons, the underlying reasons behind these, this social unrest? And the Turkish young people in Turkey, are they gatekeepers of democracy, or they would rather support and vote for the main opposition party, CHP, than the AKP, the governing party, as to political preferences? And one final question. By the way, the unfolding developments will beyond the AKP government's control in the future. So that these were questions by Professor Yongtao, directed to Hasan Hoca.
Well, now in terms of internal politics of Turkey, what I would say first, and the arrest of Greater Istanbul mayor, and the large-scale protests across Turkey that ensued. Perhaps we have to discern. I mean, there are discernible factors in the whole thing, in the protests in particular, led by young people. And also people of all sections, of the Turkish society. Now, I can basically cite the reasons, 1, 2, 3. Now, first of all, people are fed up with the incumbent government for a variety of reasons. The first is that this government has been in power far too long. Okay, they have been in power far too long to basically, and they should go. So this is the general consensus among the people. Second, I think the economic crisis in which people now have found themselves. Now, even the grassroots of the governing ruling party are fed up with the government because of their neoliberal economic policies. I think Radhika would understand it better than all of us, because the neoliberal economic policies in Turkey, I think, have caused havoc. The situation is the worst across the world, presumably. Okay, for instance, the neoliberal economic policies has ruined the middle classes, even in the United States and in Western countries too. But in a developing country like Turkey, it has caused havoc, and people don't seem to see any glimmer of hope. No, nothing, coming out of the tunnel. Okay, and therefore, this is the major problem, and the other problem is the apathy among the youngsters. I can see it quite rampant among my student community, and that because of the nepotism, large-scale nepotism by the incumbent government, they won't basically be able to get anything they deserve. So that's another problem. And if you have a government which has been extremely corrupt and very much into nepotism to the degree that it has been too, and then not only the youngsters but everybody would be frustrated with the government. The problem is the main opposition party. The main opposition party embraces all these globalist views, including the neoliberal economic policies. So, for instance, we have the Atatürk legacy, which is an economic policy led by the state sector. Alongside this state sector, you have the private sector, but you certainly have planning. Okay, all the time. It's very much like the Chinese economic policies, which has basically led to a miracle over the last 50 years or so. And the CHP is the party that Atatürk actually set up in the early 1920s. The problem is, from my point of view, the CHP is under occupation by these globalist elite, and they don't want to leave the party, and they have been losing elections one after the other, and that's the problem. So the people don't trust that, first of all, they can actually rule, okay, and second, that they have any recipe for that would get the country, that would pull the country off the crisis. So that is the main problem. So the people, on the one hand, join in the protests and the demonstrations that the CHP people are organizing, but it doesn't mean that they are the usual CHP voters. And I don't know what's going to come out of all this, but the internal politics, on the one hand, the government is government's power and government's whatever has been eroding fast, but on the other, you don't have a powerful main opposition party that could offer people glimmer of hope and with a clear agenda to put things back in the right.
Thank you, Hasan Hoca. We have two more questions before we finish. Actually, three more questions. Three more questions, and then we finish. All right. One question from Mr. Isaac Ojok, and he's interested in knowing. That's the question. Under the current emergence of multipolarity, will Europe break free from American domination and stand on its own feet? So this question is actually directed to to all vice speakers. So anyone could choose to answer this question. Radhika, you can go first if you like.
Okay. I just need to do one thing. Maybe somebody else
Of course.
I'll be back in 1 minute.
All right.
May I give my take?
Please go ahead.
I've been looking at the Europeans and their decision making and their political signaling over the last couple of years, also on my YouTube channel, and I must say I don't think the Europeans will, because they currently lack the epistemological framework to adequately understand what's happening, and updating that will take at least, in my view, it will take a decade, because even the political powers, even though there are people who would break free and would do something different, they are still in a minority on the right and the left. So I don't see this coming through electoral change. Gradually Europe will have no other choice. Necessity is going to be the mother of innovation here, also for the Europeans. But I do think this is a process of about a generation, because the current leadership of Europe and also the ones in the parties, not just on the top but on the second and third tier, are like mentally unable to wrap their minds around the changes. So they use these wrong frameworks, and those do not lend themselves to breaking free and doing their own thing.
Any other takes? Yes. Over to you, Radhika.
This is a really interesting point. And of course, one of the big puzzles of our time, as I'm sure Pascal probably said, because I didn't hear all of what he said, but is that, why is the European leadership of various European countries permitting the United States to push them towards policies that are destroying their economies? This whole Ukraine war, which has, essentially deindustrialized or very substantially is deindustrializing the German economy. So this is very peculiar, but very difficult to understand, particularly because, back again in the 50s and 60s, people like Ernest Mandel even wrote books about how the European Union project was actually a project to counter the power of the United States. But of course, over time, with its neoliberalization, once the kind of developmental state that Hassan was talking about, that you had in Turkey under Ataturk, and you had versions thereof in Europe in the initial decades after the Second World War. Once that is abandoned, once neoliberal policy becomes the norm, then I think this project is essentially undermined. And today it is very difficult, as Pascal says, to imagine that Europe would stand up to them. However, more recently, you've seen that European countries are, in fact, opening themselves up to dialogue with China in particular, and I think that is a development that will have some potential, because I think a day or two after the Liberation Day, on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, you also witnessed there was news about how China, Japan, and South Korea were meeting in about how to take up the challenge of Trump's tariffs. And maybe while I'm doing that, I'll also, since I've come there, I'll also answer the question that is about Trump's tariffs. What do I think will be the impact on the world? And I think, of course, in the immediate, what Trump has done is with his on-again, off-again tariffs, and it seems as though he's certainly, he calls himself the great deal maker, but actually he's much more like a mafioso who has, first of all, created the danger of these blanket tariffs, and then depending on whoever he's talking to, he will negotiate. Yesterday, I believe he made some further concessions on tariffs because he was visiting some auto manufacturing city and what have you. So, depending on who comes, he will make some concessions and others. But the net effect of these tariffs has actually been less about tariffs and more about a pervasive sense of uncertainty in the world economy, which is generated by Trump. And I think that I'm not sure there is going to be an easy end to this. I think we'll certainly continue as long as Trump is the president of the United States. And as some people have been pointing out, and I also have been saying, the fact is that what we've realized after Trump's re-election is, when Biden was elected, people had the luxury of thinking that Trump was the aberration. But with his re-election, it seems very clear that Biden was the aberration, that in fact, the United States is in a deep and wide crisis whose effect is the election of Trump. Now, if that is the case, no matter how individually psychopathic and sociopathic rather Trump may be, and he certainly is that, ultimately the uncertainty arises from the fact that the United States is in the throes of a deep crisis. And that means that the effect of Trump's tariffs and more generally of the condition in which the United States finds itself is that the rest of the world, insofar as it is able, is going to turn away from the United States, stop doing as much trade as before with the United States, stop having as close economic relations as they did with the United States, and move towards diversifying their trade link. And of course, as they do so, which is the country with the greatest economic gravity, with the greatest economic magnetism? It's China. China today has already become the most important trading partner for the vast majority of the world's countries, and it has the potential to reinforce and deepen this position. And I would say that the effect of Trump's tariffs, therefore, and for me, it is really the effect of the crisis of the United States, will be that the rest of the world will increasingly move away from Trump. And I think they do so again, the uncertainty will be replaced by a new certainty which will be created by the rest of the world, a new certainty based on new types of economic relations to which I was referring in the end of my speech, relations of mutual economic benefit under new rubrics, or perhaps by revitalizing the United Nations, by recalling and reinvigorating its original founding principles in its charter. One way or the other, I think, because the UN is also a very important resource. I think a lot of people simply see what has gone wrong with the UN, but not what was really very important, fundamentally anti-imperialist genesis of the United Nations. But anyway, so I think that the effect will be actually to the detriment of the United States. The world will suffer, but not as much as Trump imagines.
Perfect, Radhika. That also seems to answer Professor Wei Min's question about the impact of Trump's tariffs war. Next up, we have a question from Dr. Zhang Su, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So he or she has a question for Professor Hasan Ünal. And again, the question is about Turkey and the current world order. So what role do you think Turkey wants to play in the multipolar world? And another question, many countries see Trump's tariff war as a challenge, but from the media, at the level of the Turkish government, it seems, I mean, at least the Turkish government sees this as an opportunity. And most people think Turkey has the ability to resolve this dispute. So he's just curious about Turkey's position in a multipolar world order, Professor Hasan. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the question too. It is not about what role Turkey wants to play in a multipolar world order, but what role Turkey can actually play in the multipolar world order. What I would say that although it is normally, the usual phrase is that Turkey is a member of NATO and blah blah. Yes, it is. And it is also a member of the Western world. Well, yes, but not. Okay. And therefore, in a multipolar world order, what role could it actually play? Well, it's actually the Turkish foreign policy towards the war in Ukraine gives us quite a few evidence, to basically evaluate what role Turkey can play. Now, okay, it's a member of NATO, but it didn't join the anti-Russia sanctions. Okay, and it certainly did not open up the whole Black Sea against Russia. If Turkey had actually let the Western powers use the Black Sea area as a theater of war against Russia, Russia would have found it extremely, well, certainly not easy. It would have been quite difficult for Russia to deal with the emerging situation in a conventional warfare. And the other thing is, Turkey is in itself an important conventional military power to be reckoned with. So, but it didn't use any of that against Russia, nor did it use its geographic position to be used against Russia either. If anything, it has actually, how shall I say, it had been cultivating best possible ties to Moscow before the war broke out. Even during the Cold War, Turkey did likewise from 1965 to almost into 1980s for about 2 decades. Even in the heat of the Cold War, Turkey basically cozied up to Russia, or warmed up to Soviet Union rather than Russia, for economic cooperation and trade and what have you. And whatever industrial, in heavy industry and the industrial infrastructure we have today is thanks to Turkish-Soviet cooperation in those 2 decades, by the way. So what I'm saying, Turkey could carry on with that policy, with that approach, and it has done it, despite certain times of how shall I say, getting off the point a bit here and getting off the point over there. But overall, it has managed that quite successfully. I call it the juggler. So Turkey is going to be a juggler. So one hand in the Western world through NATO membership, and if the Europeans, for instance, are going to set up, which I would very much doubt, some sort of security arrangement for themselves, then again they would have to knock on Turkey's doors, and Turkey would not, I would say, in normal circumstances, cooperate with a Europe if it is dead against Russia, militarily speaking, but you would never know the circumstances that would actually emerge. So what I would say, this juggler position is, I think, going to be the dominant position in the evolving multipolar world order for Turkey, though the present government's policy, particularly in the Middle East, gets easily infected by Islamist ideology, which turns quite a few countries against Turkey quite easily. And they did it in the past for more than a decade. These days, they are a bit careful about that, but still, when it comes to Middle Eastern matters, the present Islamist-inspired government doesn't seem to act quite professionally, but, and they are not going to be in power they will have to go in the next few years one way or the other. So what I would say, even they are in power, which is very unlikely, Turkey will continue to play this juggler role. Actually, I've got a short and a slightly, a short piece on the Valdai page. So Zhang Shu, Madame Zhang Shu actually can actually consult.
Thank you very much, Hasan Hoca. And our two final questions are directed to Professor Guo, but I think Radhika could also answer the first question. Up to you. I mean, the first question is from Mr. Emre Köse, and he says that there are many obstacles to the BRICS bloc's ambition and the dominance of the American dollar, but it seems impossible to achieve this goal without ending the dominance of finance itself. So, Mr. Guo or Radhika, do you have any thoughts on whether a finance-free economy is possible? Perfect. Please, Professor Guo, you can go first. Emre, if you could just unmute Professor Guo.
Okay, thank you. Yes. There are many obstacles within BRICS. Say to have a general finance policy, at least among the BRICS countries, China need to actually to deal with relations with another big country, India. To get a same voice is relatively difficult. But I would like to suggest, say, Emery, you can pay close attention or keep eyes on how China and Brazil, say, for the bilateral trade, for the currency settlement, pay attention to all the trade between China and Southeast countries, how they do the currency settlement. There is, I think, there is evidence, BRICS or China try to find ways to change, if not to challenge, the U.S. dollar hegemony. I think for multipolar world order, I think if not U.S. dominated order or Western dominated order financially, there should also be multipolar currency systems. I think during the first term of Trump's administration, especially, I think since the Ukraine crisis, actually China have to get prepared for the financial issues. The difficulties Russia faced if they banned from the SWIFT. I think anyway, China prepared technically and internationally to prepare the ways, for a multipolar system, politically, geopolitically, and financially. And also, I suggest you can pay close attention. Just yesterday, President Xi visited the BRICS Bank in Shanghai, meet the president of former president of Brazil, Rousseff. You know why President Xi to pay a visit to this Bank of BRICS? I think they will. I think the BRICS try to figure out how to, to make alternative of a financial system. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Goel. Much appreciated. And Radhika, would you have something to add?
No, I mean, I would say that as far as well, there are several obstacles. One of them is obviously that there is simply the inertia of the dollar system, which remains, which is difficult to overcome. But more than that, I think there are two other important obstacles. I think that in order to conceive an international currency system that would replace the dollar system, because the dollar is not going to be replaced by another national currency posing as the world's currency. This has already made. I mean, the fundamental unviability of such a proposition has already made the dollar system extremely volatile, extremely crisis-prone. And extremely, with many negative consequences for the rest of the world. We can talk about that. So in the journey to that, I think most the people have to understand that you would have to create an international currency. Create an international currency, and again, it will not be a currency like the euro, which is used both, which is essentially replaced national currencies. This currency will not replace national currencies, but in line with Keynes's proposals at Bretton Woods in 1944, it will be a currency used by central bankers to settle imbalances with one another. And I think that in creating any such alternative, it will be very important to recall all the reasons, at least recall the principles on which Keynes' system was based, which included, for example, diminishing trade imbalances as much as possible, which is the opposite of the dollar system. The dollar system systematically relies on trade imbalances and payments imbalances because the US provides the world with liquidity by running deficits. And then, of course, the inevitable effect of this has to be counteracted by massive financial flows into and out of the dollar-denominated system of assets. So people have to understand that it will be an arrangement between central banks. It will not replace national currencies. And if it is that, there will be a second thing, which is it's going to require practically a revolution to arrive at, and that is that people have to accept capital controls. Keynes' system would never work without capital controls, and if you didn't have capital controls, you will not be able to work this system. And so this is critically important, and I think that in many countries, including many BRICS countries, and countries like Turkey, countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, the elites of these societies are simply too addicted to the dollar system. They're simply too dependent on keeping a substantial part of their money in the dollar system. And I think that this is going to be a big obstacle to overcome. But if these obstacles can be overcome, perhaps beginning in a small way, perhaps China can create alternatives. And I think that such a system will emerge. It may not emerge in one fell swoop, as you know, in some kind of a summit of the concerned leaders. It may emerge step by step. But I think that one way or the other, moving away from the dollar system will require a system that more and more matches the principles on which Keynes's a system of the International Clearing Union and Banco were originally based. So,
one more sentence I want to say.
Sure.
Say actually we talk about this issue with some financial specialists here in Shanghai. Actually, I'm told that I know nothing about finance, and I'm told that actually the dollar system actually based on credit. It's credit-based. This is different of, say, a good system. Dollar system, credit-based. If, the credit is no more there, so the system will finally collapse. But if you want to find a new system, you need to find another credit-based currency. Up to now, no other choice. But gradually, maybe in the multipolarized world, finally, maybe there will be some new ways or new currencies, I think. Anyway, for the United States, if they want to continue to keep the credit, they should stop the tariff war. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Go. And finally, I'd like to convey a question by Serdar Yurtçiçek, Managing Editor of Geopolitical Economy. And again, this question is directed to Professor Go. So his question is, could a potential U.S.-Russia rapprochement combined with Trump's tariff policies catalyze a new alliance dynamic in the international system, like how EU-China relations have evolved recently, and what systemic implications might this create? That's the question.
Oh, okay. To be brief, very brief, just take a glance at the history of European or the Western society. I want to say the West country society, they tend to allies to make allies from they like to make allies. Since the ancient Greek times, in the medieval ages and modern times, they try to make allies. So for this trend, I don't think the Western world in a multipolar under the multipolarized context, they will keep solidarity. So for European countries, or some of the European countries would ally with China is much predictable or possible. They like to allies or to make allies, making an ally with other countries. This is the tradition in the history, always this case. So under this new multipolarized context, there's a big likelihood for better European-China relations. Thanks for that.
Many thanks, Professor Go. Serdar, I think that answers your question. Well, we have had such a insightful and engaging discussion, but I'm afraid we're out of time. That's all the time we have for today. A big thank you once again to Professor Go, Professor Desai, Radhika Desai, Professor Hasan Ünal, and Professor Pascal Lotas for being so generous with their time and expertise. We very much hope to continue this conversation in our upcoming webinars for global geopolitics. So please make sure to follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter series in order to stay informed about our upcoming events and also our calls for forthcoming calls for papers. That's it for us. That's it from us for now, and we will look forward to seeing you in our upcoming events and webinars. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, very
Bye-bye.
nice. Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mm.